Good morning, everyone, and thank you for joining me, Sangha, and my wonderful co-host, Morten Matheson. It is the second episode of Season 2 Take Care podcast, and today we have none other than Donald Macaskill, CEO of Scottish Care, with us. Donald, you are such an icon, and the thoughts you share on LinkedIn are pure gold. Welcome.
Thank you. I've never been described as an icon. They're usually the things that you end up shattering. So I'm pleased to be here.
No, we are so glad to have you.
Yes, it's wonderful to see you again, Donald. I went to a Scottish Care event. It's some years back now where I remember seeing you for the first time and experiencing what I think Sangha is right in saying, an icon, someone who cares about the sector, who knows the sector really well, and who is a voice for all the people that draw on services and work in services in social care. So I'm also very pleased to welcome you on board today, and really interested in hearing about some of the things Scottish Care is doing with regards to digital and technology, and of course hearing more about you and where you've come from into your role with Scottish Care. So let's start there. How did you end up with Scottish Care?
So I ended up working with Scottish Care primarily because before I took this role on, I was working as a freelance consultant, and I was running an equality and human rights consultancy for just over a decade, just nearly a decade and a half. And as part of that work, did some work with Scottish Care on human rights and older people, and began to like the organisation. I had a background in care in its broadest sense. I used to run a learning disability organisation and charity, which helped individuals leave long-stay institutional care and move into the community, and which brought together families, individuals, educators, social work, and various other professionals. So the care sector has long been the area in which I've done a lot of work. And when the Scottish Care role came up, I thought rather than continue being a consultant, travelling around as many consultants do, I wanted a bit more of a settled experience. Little did I realise that 2 years in, I would be faced with a global pandemic.
Yeah, absolutely. That was somewhat of a catastrophe for all of us. And I guess what you're saying about human rights really almost leads me directly to what I'm concerned about today and wanting to talk to you about is you've made a charter for human rights and technology. Where did you end with just that as your result of, I guess, some kind of a concern?
I have always been interested in technology and digital, both at a personal and a professional level. From the moment that, as a young person at school, I was brought to a room in my local university, which was literally half a mile. I was brought up in the university campus, and in this room there was one of the original computers. And the technician involved at the time said, by the time you're my age, all of this will be in a cigarette packet size. Now, I thought he must have been really ancient, but he probably was only 40. But he was making the point that the pace of technological change was so fast that things would be unrecognisable within my lifetime. And of course, that's been the reality. We have moved from early developments into artificial intelligence, the Internet of Things. We're in a, not only can I listen to every piece of music I'm likely to listen to in something the size of a cigarette packet, but I can communicate with individuals in all parts of the world, and the pandemic has accelerated those advances. So technology has always interested me. But so too have been a concern about how do we get technology as a servant rather than we becoming the slave of technology? How do we enable technology to help us to live our lives better rather than to restrict our lives? So my human rights perspective is very much aligned with my technological interest. And a few years ago, shortly after I started with Scottish Care, I wrote something called Tech Rights, which was really a review and a report following conversations with various people in different parts of the world about robotics, about the Internet of Things, about how we can use technology to maximize the experience, particularly of older people, and what we need to be aware of in terms of the, at times, gushing enthusiasm without ethics, which happens in the world of technology. And one of the recommendations I made in that report was that we needed to develop a charter which started from the moment of idea and conception, which included people, that there was design was involving those who were most impacted by the technology from the moment the idea was developed, all the way through to implementation, use, and evaluation. And then colleagues very much took this on, talked to others, brought on other stakeholders like care providers, and really delighted that one of my colleagues in that time, Dr. Tara French, who was then at the Glasgow School of Art and then came to work with us, very much pushed forward the charter into what we ended up with. And it's been taken further by my new colleague, Nicola Cooper, who's our head of technology and design at Scottish Care. So it's been about putting principles of human rights in the whole process of technology and digital within social care.
That's fantastic. And that's something Morten and we have been talking to some of our colleagues and exploring how we could, not steal, but get inspired from the great work that you have done and your colleagues have done, and bring that to England as well, and have one charter. I've always said and maintained that, we should have one, not multiple, because we are all talking about the same thing. It's how do you ensure that specifically people whom we care and people who work with us are covered with regards to the usage of technology and data, which like you say is exponentially growing. I read your recent article, Donald, and you mentioned about always a bridesmaid and never a bride. So what will change the situation, do you think? What is that one thing that you reckon is the must doing that needs to happen to change that scenario?
Oh my goodness, that's a big one. If I can go back to the observation that you made about the charter is not what is important. It is the conversation that's important. The charter is an end product, is a means to an end, is a stimulation for thinking and for inclusion. When I was writing the piece that you've just talked about, it was the substance of a talk I gave a couple of weeks ago. And really, I was trying to articulate that we need to understand that social care is distinct from healthcare, is not just care. It's something which has a social dynamic to it. And what I mean by that is that it is a sector, a set of services, a dynamic of relationships which have to do with helping people to live their life to the fullest, to help them flourish until the end of their life, by being independent, by having choice, by discovering a voice, by being enabled to direct their lives rather than being the actors responding to somebody else's direction. And so technology, I think, can very much enable us to put social care center stage as a set of supports, as a model, as an approach that enables individuals to realize their own potential. However, and I think this is the reason for the charter, technology can also limit people. It can, in the works recently of colleagues who wrote a digital cage is still a cage, it can actually be used in a way to reduce somebody's independence, remove their privacy, prevent them from exercising choice and using their voice. And so often when we talk about services, we are very predictive. We imagine that we know, whoever we are, what the person wants. And like a parent who finishes the sentences of their children because we know them best, we make the mistake of presuming that we know what somebody's life aims and dreams are. Social care at its best is freed from such suppositions.
That's a really great point. And I, having read, of course, the charter, and also I believe you call it the digital or the vision for technology and digital in social care, which I guess is either the platform on which the charter stands or a development of the charter. I think you're right in seeing it in these different brackets or different roles, especially if we talk about people that draw on services. And I'm also a big critic of how a lot of the systems work today, because they're very, very much focused on a limited section of what a provider will provide of support and so on. They're mainly focused on where unfortunately, the inspection regime is the hardest. And that's most often on making sure that people are safe. But what about all the other things, as you're mentioning? Do I prefer a bath here at 10:30 this morning, or would I actually, when I see you, would I prefer that you and I would go for a walk together? And is that my choice, or is it down to whatever routine is pinned into your time and task care plan right now? And I think that's where we need to go, and perhaps look at international models as well for how that's currently being exercised and delivered, perhaps even commissioned and so on. I lean a lot towards the Dutch model of Buurtzorg, where they're actually trying to be more team-based, more self-organized as the care teams, but also with regards to individual rights and needs and interests and preferences, leave more room for the actual individual. And that should be respected also in the actual technologies, whether they are virtual reality or some of the things that you've mentioned so far. Where do you see that right now in the sector? Do you agree with me?
I always agree with you, Morten, in most things, but I very much agree with you about what you're saying, if I can break it down a little bit. So technology should be there to help me be an autonomous individual. I think the concept of autonomy is really important. It's psychologically extremely important for me as an individual to have that maturity of who I am. And that means necessarily that the system should be set up in a way, and the technology should be developed and used in a way that enables me to maximize my autonomy and personal control, be that who sees my data and who knows my story, all the way to whether or not I choose to have my dinner at 6 o'clock or at 9 o'clock. In other words, a lot of our systems are about structuring the mess of living. And I sometimes use the phrase, it's really important that social care allows us to play with the messiness of our lives and our loves. And life is not tidy, it is not linear, it is not coordinated. It is usually at its best something that happens to us when we least expect and when we most need relationship and encounter. So for me, a system has to give space for autonomy. It has to have an opportunity and place for a lack of structure and a mess or a lack of coordination. So you mentioned the Buurtzorg model, and I'm familiar with Buurtzorg. I think we need to look at why is that a successful model. And as a practitioner, one of the reasons it's successful for is that it trusts the professional integrity, the autonomy of the individual team member. It treats them as an adult, not an operator, a widget in a system. And it gives them the scope to take decision and make mistakes and to take risk. Social care is not about safety. It is about risk enablement. But most of the way in which our systems, both technological and human, are created are to manage risk and reduce risk rather than to enable life and relationship. And that comes all the way back to the way we resource social care. So it's not by accident that the staff in a Buurtzorg team are as equivalent, if not better remunerated and rewarded than a nurse or a carer in an acute hospital, because they are seen as being just as important, just as equivalent. We pay and we reward and we remunerate those who deliver social care way at the bottom of our societal value fiscal calculation. So we can't have autonomy, trust, staff taking risks, engaged in an adventure with the self, if we pay them in a way that doesn't respect them as those autonomous individuals. So for me, technology must always be something that it gives the person control, gives them autonomy, and is used to maximize that, rather than the way it often is at the moment, which is about management, maintenance, and restriction.
That's beautifully said there, Donald. I loved every word that you said there. I was also, mulling over another article of yours which said, "Let's plan to age," and that's a really thought-provoking idea that you have shared there, because you know social care is we are not conscious about the sector in the way we should be, because we think we will reach out to social care when we need it, but we don't know when we will need it, and it doesn't have to be like that. It's all about how do we prepare ourselves. So how are you seeing the sector changing, or are you seeing there has been any change with regards to how people are starting to plan for old age, for the age of vulnerability? We are all living longer. We are all having different set of challenges to fight for, starting from cost of living going up, the financial pressure, the technological pressure, so on and so forth. What are you seeing, and what are your visions on that?
I think it's really difficult for people to plan positively, because at the moment we are in such a negative environment and atmosphere, the cost of living, a massive energy crisis, which brings real system threat to social care in particular. What I think I was trying to say in that article was that we plan for life, and we plan for birth, and we plan for the start of our life. We need to give the same equivalence and attention to older age or our later age, and to do so not in the sense that you're planning for decline, decay, and ending, but you're planning to live life to the fullest until the moments at the later stage in life. So even the concept of vulnerability, which you mentioned there, vulnerability is not problematic. It's not a negative if it's viewed as part and parcel of the human condition. Vulnerability only becomes a problem when somebody uses that vulnerability to hurt or harm or limit me. So planning for older age does mean thinking practically, well, if I'm living in a 2-story house, how can I enable it to be as accessible as possible into my older age? Because I'm a great believer that you shouldn't move from where you have your sense of community and belonging simply because you reach a certain age. Just adapt, develop. And that's a huge role for technology in order to maintain the relationships and the connections. But I think we need a societal change in attitude to older age to enable people to think creatively about how they plan for their older life, and not see older age as a time where you've had all your adventures, you've said all you want to say, and you've done all you want to achieve. Instead, see older age as just another stage. I may or I may not climb all the mountains I want, though there is a guy recently in his 80s who's just climbed most of the Scottish Munros. It's probably not me. But you still have adventures, dreams, and discoveries into the future. And we need to change the negative into a positive about older age. Technology has huge potential to enable that change.
I'm so glad that you say that, because it's obviously coming from such a company that that should, and I believe also do, contribute to a slightly different vision of how technology at least ought to enable care and support work, and definitely individuals in their own rights, in their own time, should they wish, of course. There is that element of inclusion, which I think is, especially because we're now talking about older age, there is that element of inclusion where, as a society, we also need to be aware of not leaving anyone behind. And of course, doing like you're also doing in Scottish Care, having cafes or open hours sessions where this can be discussed, and how, at least from a supplier's perspective, we need to think about this. We need to make sure that there is accessibility, legibility, and so on in the solutions that we provide, and to have that pressure coming from yourself personally, and also from Scottish Care as an organ in the sector is hugely important. Do you think that? Here's my question then: do you think that it's possible for you to play that role?
I think it's necessary for all of us involved in aged care to play the role of both the advocate and the dreamer, and they're related. So take accessibility, which you mentioned, Morton. I think we need to broaden what we mean by accessibility. And so often in the technology world, we think accessibility is about a. Well, I'll use an example. When I did equality training 2-3 decades ago and delivered courses around disability, the motive at the time was, and a lot of energy was spent with organisations putting in ramps, widening doors, enabling the built environment to be fully accessible for somebody who might need support. We did not spend enough or equivalent amount of time altering the attitudinal environment and the behaviours and the attitudes of individuals to somebody with a disability or autism or long-term condition. So what we created was spaces for people to move into, but not places for people to feel included. And if I use the same comparative for technology, we have got better at enable accessibility, connectivity, etc. But we have not always understood that that's the easy bit. It's how we use the technology, whether we give real autonomy and control to the person, that what ultimately matters. So the fact that we still use devices that can't be used by a population, the majority of whom have a visual impairment, the majority of whom have some degree of oral limitation, and the majority of whom have issues with dexterity and manipulation. So I think both as producers of secondary devices and producers of software, we need to really reconceive how do we see accessibility. It's not just changing the door, changing the device, it's changing the way in which it's used, its physical and emotional, environmental impact and use.
That's a really good point, and it's a lot more. It's broader than I'd thought it to be to begin with. Because, as you say, these are choices that are not only made when it comes to whichever feature and whichever system you like or prefer. It is societal, and it's a really, really valid point here. Which brings me to something else that I think, because we have Sanger and you here, we need to talk about. The paper that you put out that was called Seeing the Diamond in Social Care Data. And I know we don't have a lot of time left for us, but can you just give us a brief introduction to this, or some of the reasons why you did this?
So this was a paper that was produced not by myself, and I put my hand up saying I know nothing about data. It was produced by my colleague Karen Hedge and by Dr. Tara French, who was then working with us. And it was really talking about how do we use data in social care. And one of the pleas within that paper was that we need to have a very mature conversation about what do we mean by data. So the first premise of it is really data is basically my story, and that's a motif and a metaphor that's been used quite often. I should not, if I am accessing or I need to access services and supports, have to tell my story more than once. But I secondly need to have control over my story. I may choose to tell you, Morten, part of my story, and I may choose to tell somebody else another part of my story, but it should be my choice. I need to be both the author, the teller, the controller, and the editor of my story. And you need to recognize, if you are in services using and accessing my data, that my story changes. And today I may wake up wanting jam on my toast, but tomorrow I may want cheese. And if you're working with data about yesterday, then you are not responding to my needs today. In other words, because I have changed, my story's changed. And I use that as an example of the fundamental issues that we need to talk about in terms of data. Who has access? Who has control? The human right of privacy, the human right of autonomy and choice. We have in Scotland a very real opportunity with the creation of a National Care Service to get us closer to getting this right. But I really worry that the people whose story data tells are not the people who are designing the story which data sells.
That's a great point.
And that's what we see as well. The story keeps changing, but we don't reflect that. Many of the providers that we work with, we capture the story once. It's captured more as a chore, nor as a beautiful story to be celebrated and made aware of, at least by the people who are providing the care, and getting that story reflective of what the current situation is, but also including the person in writing that story. I think I love the way you have explained it there, Donald. The whole data being this life story of the people we care, and there's a lot of work that needs to happen. Not just from capturing, understanding that story, but also how much of that could then be used with the help of technology to provide better care. How much of that should not be out, it should be within the close proximity of the person who is delivering the care and receiving care. So all those kind of understanding has to happen in the sector. And I completely agree that we are sitting on gold dust, we are sitting on diamonds, but we are perhaps not using it to fine tune our services, to fine tune the care that we could deliver, but not make it one size fits all for all. I think there is an opportunity for giving more personalized care if we are mindful of understanding what that life story is all about.
And I really liked how the hashtag for the delivery of this paper was "Data Changes Lives" instead of "Data Saves Lives." I know that it potentially can also, but it's very much along the lines of what you're doing now, Sanga. And I think it's a very, very good place to also finish this conversation, that data technology has this rich potential of changing people's lives, improving, supporting, but it's something we need to be very aware of how we do. So, Donald, thank you very much for joining us today. It's a real pleasure having you on.
A pleasure to have the opportunity to chat to you both.
Thank you.
Thank you so much, Donald.
Take care.
Take care.
Thank you for listening. Don't forget to subscribe, review, and share your favorite Take Care podcast with your friends and colleagues. Until we meet next week, take care.